thinking about race and the role of the university, I feel like we've simultaneously put too much on the university and not expected enough. So in some ways we've asked for too much, and in some ways not expected enough. So what do I say when we say too much? Like if you think about affirmative action policies from the 80s and some that persist, I think there was a perspective that, well, we've almost idolized education. We've taken education and the ability to achieve higher education as that is what will save you. That is what, how do we solve racial injustice? We'll just give people education. If we give people education, then everything will be fine. But even thinking of the story that I had of my great grandfather, he had an education in the turn of the century. That didn't change the fact that he was black, and that didn't change anything else about the world around him. And so to expect that we can solve a majority, I think there is a perspective that we can solve a majority of our cultural racial problems through education, and thus higher education becomes like the linchpin. If we can solve higher education, then everything will be fine. And that's just not the case. I haven't been in school. I mean, I work at a university, but I haven't been in school for years, and I can tell you there's still plenty of racial issues that are out there. I have a PhD from Stanford, and that doesn't make me immune from racial stuff. I used to live in Somerville, and my wife and I noticed something. I lived in Davis Square, and so I would take the T from Kendall Square at MIT to Davis, and walking home, almost any time of the evening, 5, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, I noticed I would be walking down the street and people would cross the street. So if I'm walking down the street on the same street, people would cross the street, and it happened enough at first. So there's a problem when you're black. So they say that men think about sex every 8 seconds. Black people think about race every second. You're always wondering, it's like, is this because I'm black? It's like, and so I'm walking down the street and I would see people cross, and I'm like, why are they doing that? And I thought, it must be me. That was my first thought, is it must be me. I am reading something into, there's nothing. People wouldn't do that. And then I saw at least one person cross back. So they crossed, and then I turned around and they went back. So now I'm thinking, okay, no, that's not me. That was her. It's almost like what you would do if you saw like a stray dog on the street. Like if you saw a stray dog, you don't know that dog. Like that's not my dog. I'm gonna cross because I don't know if that could be a dangerous dog. Let me make sure I have my space. So in the event I need to run or this dog goes and attacks me, I have some safety. Like that's how people were treating me. PhD from Stanford, professor at MIT. Like they should be robbing me. they're the ones crossing the street. So the thought that education is going to solve these, my education did nothing for me in those situations. I go to conferences now, and I'll tell one more story. I went to a conference and talking to a friend of mine that I knew from graduate school, and she introduced me to a friend of hers who was going to be running this particular conference at its next installation. So she thought it would be good career networking for me to meet her. And so she introduced me to this friend of hers, and I said hello, and the friend says, oh, I remember you. I saw you at the last meeting. Weren't you at the meeting that was in Seoul? I was like, yeah, I was in that meeting. How did you know that? She's like, oh, well, there aren't that many colored people that come to these meetings. Colored people. How do I deal with this? I have so many things, just like little micro things like that my education does nothing for. So that's how I feel like the emphasis that if we just solve the education problem, that's just going to make all the racial harmony, I think is too little. But at the same time, I do think we do need to hold universities responsible, because there is a lot of power, there is a lot of cultural, socioeconomic authority that is given once you get a college degree. There's access, there's political, social, all kinds of things that come out of where you go to school. So it's clearly important. And so I don't want to say that, well, the universities don't matter, but I think that it has to be more than education. It can't just be you get a college degree and then we do nothing about all the other social problems that we have that are tied to race.
I'm really glad you went first for that question. It was a difficult one, and it gave me time to think also. those kind of stories. And I'm sorry to hear them, and I think, you know, similar things happen to me, but in kind of different ways. Actually, I was talking to my Asian American class about racial microaggressions, and we ran through a whole series of scenarios about, you know, things like that happen, and we talked about how do you deal with these issues and how do you talk about them. And then they were surprised to learn, you know, at the end that these scenarios were not things I'd made up, but were things that happened to me or people I knew. And they're like, oh, wow, you know. No, I have to say, it's not that people like move across the sidewalk when they see me coming in. Actually, the problem is that they'll actually come talk to me. You know, like they feel like they can just talk to me somehow, and intrude in my space is really the darndest thing.
Maybe the two of us should hang out. We both walk down the street, maybe they'll just say they're attracted to you and they repel from me.
I'll tell you one story that happened recently, and you know, it's a hard story to tell, but I have a new colleague who's African American, and she and I were having lunch in Newton Central. It was a really fancy restaurant. Newton is a very liberal but majority white place. And she and I got to this restaurant. We were the first, really, you know, get there early. And we had our choice of seats and put us right in the middle. It was nice. We were having a nice conversation, and the restaurant is filling up. And then I look up, and nobody's sitting next to us. And then there's like a nice couple comes in, nice white couple comes in. They're seated right next to us, and then they're like, oh, you know, we'd rather sit like over there, so they can move. And you know, and then by the end of the meal, the restaurant is like packed, except there's nobody sitting on either side of us. You know, that could be just coincidence, right? But probably not. So, you know, it was like, what do you talk about? And sure, everybody in the restaurant is college educated, right? So what are we doing wrong in college? We get caught up in numbers, which is important, right? I mean, it really matters how many students get to go to college, because this is about access to really important resources. So I would never say we should not talk about numbers, but we get caught up and think that if we can just get those numbers up, we solve the problem, and that's not the case, right? I think another issue is segregation. Like, students just stick to their own kind. There's not a lot of opportunities to talk to each other. You know, when it comes to the discussion of race, it's always the same group of people who are there in the room talking to one another, right? And it's a struggle, right? And I know a lot of white students who are very smart, very well-meaning, who care about social issues, who want to find a way to talk about race, and they just say, you know, I don't know how to talk about this, right? They really struggle. They don't have a vocabulary, they don't have an opportunity. And so it's not just about numbers, it's also about curriculum. It's about social events. It's about, well, what are we teaching our students? What kind of opportunities are we creating, right? How are we modeling for our students how to have difficult conversations with one another? So that there's a curricular issue as well as a numbers issue. And then on top of that, I think that there's an economic issue that we really cannot ignore. Colleges and universities are increasingly being run as a business. You know, sometimes I like to joke that a school like NYU, for instance, is really a real estate company that also does a side business in education. God, I hope this doesn't get public. I get in trouble for saying that. But you know, schools are being run like a business, and I think that's a problem too. You know, and students are being encouraged to think of themselves as a business, right? I mean, how many of you have heard the phrase human capital, right? You've got to invest in your human capital. Like you're an iPhone or something.
And your brand.
Yeah, your brand, right? So why do you go to college? To get credentials, right? To find a good job, to get a good return on investment. Like the business language is creeping into education, right? And so nowhere in this way of thinking is you know, it's reflection on education as the place where, you know, you really begin to have the really difficult conversations that matter. And that the university is a really important institution that teaches young people how to grow up to become good citizens of their countries. I mean, I feel crazy, old-fashioned for using a word like citizenship, but I think You know, if there's a particular idea of citizenship that I really like, and I think colleges and universities are important institutions for teaching citizenship, for knowing, for teaching young people what it means to belong to a society, what it means to give back, what it means to participate, and to be thoughtful citizens of their country. How do you have those conversations? How do you stick to topics that are so important and yet so boring? Like taxes. Like taxes are probably the most important conversation that we can have, and nobody wants to ever have it because you talk about taxes and their eyes start to glaze over. But it's really important, and we need students to learn how to do those kinds of conversations, to think about those issues, to be critical, not to get caught up in the idea that only experts can talk about certain kinds of issues, right? What does it mean to be informed? What does it mean to be critical? And those are the things that humanities in particular teach. And that's why I'm in the humanities. And it feels to me really kind of another part of the problem, right? Because we're not doing these things, we're not teaching these kinds of courses. We're not telling students this is what you come to college and university for, this is what you get out of it. And what's good for the country as well, that we have an educated population who've gone to colleges and universities and even high schools where these kinds of things are discussed, where people know how to, have difficult conversations, how to stay informed, and how to contribute, and to feel that they should contribute, right? In big and small ways.
Can I jump off of something you said really fast?
I think you can, go ahead.
Okay, so I really agreed with a lot of that, and all of it. And it reminded me of things I see at MIT. And so not to talk about MIT students in particular, but I think MIT, it's one of the top institutions. And something that I've talked to students who have struggled at MIT, and I've asked them sometimes, some of them I asked, well, why did you come to MIT? And some of them said, well, this was the highest ranked place I got into. So it wasn't this strong passion for science and engineering that they probably wrote about in their essay. It was, this was the highest ranked place I got into, and it was probably like they looked at like the starting average salaries coming out of school, and it's like, this place is going to give me a good job. And I think if we look at higher education as job training, then discussions of race, like why do I need to talk about race? I'm trying to figure out how I can get into McKinsey. I'm trying to figure out how I get this consulting job, how I can get into Wall Street. What does race have to do with that? What does taxes have to do with that? What does social justice have to do with that? Just tell me what I need to know so I can get this job. And I personally think that higher education should be more so about how to think, not what to think. And there's just more interest on just tell me what I need to know so that I can move on to the next thing. And really it should be about tell me the process of how to think, because that I can use for the rest of my life. And then thinking about an earlier point you mentioned of talking about race, I think we have to, I feel like we need new language. It's one thing you see nationally, if anyone ever gets called a racist, that is like the scarlet letter. No one wants to be called a racist. But because of that, no one wants to talk about race, because if you say something, like if I talk to you, I want to ask a legitimate question about what it was like growing up with your background. There's this fear, well, I don't know, he might think I'm racist if I ask that question. And that fear actually prevents the conversation. So then my prejudice just sits there and it just festers rather than ever getting out. I actually think this is a place where Christianity can help in its truest sense, in the sense that if you believe that you're a sinner, so Christianity teaches that we're all less than perfect. So when I say sinner, I'm saying less than perfect. So if we're all less than perfect, if you call me a racist, well, I already knew I was less than perfect, so you're not really damaging my self-value. You're just really calling me a sinner, which is what I should have already known about myself. And so I should be able to walk into a situation realizing that I'm less than perfect and have the open conversation, because you're not going to damage something about my value. I get my value in the fact that I have a Savior who died for me, not because I'm perfect. And if you can have that humility, I think we can actually have these discussions about race and other challenging topics with open and honesty, rather than now you have to put up a mirror because you don't want to be called a racist, you don't want to be called sexist, you don't want anythingist, you don't want to be called any of those things. But we need to have conversations in those places where it's murky, where you could get hurt, in order to ever really move past these things and in many ways, I think we're in a worse place than we were decades ago, where we were confronting the issues. Now we just don't want to talk about them, and so everyone just harbors their prejudice and just doesn't talk about it, because the last thing you want to do is be labeled one of these things, and certainly not publicly. That would be even worse.
I just want to add that, you know, it's kind of a demoralizing thing to think that we're going backwards, but I think you're right. I mean, you know, when it comes to talking about these issues, I think we're going backwards for sure. And I would also say, you know, just your comment about like how sad it is that students go to college thinking that they want to get a good job, right? That college is the route to a good job, that it's about credentials, which it often is. But if that's the primary motive, if that's all you're thinking about, if that's how you treat colleges and universities, then actually, you know, that actively discourages you from seeking out courses that talk about these issues, that talk about race, right? Because they're afraid. If I have on my transcript, right, that I took African American Studies course, an Asian American Studies course, or a course on race and justice, some employers might label me a troublemaker. I don't want that on my transcript, so I'm not going to take those courses, right? So if you're thinking about college education only as a means to getting a good job, then you start making some unfortunate choices about the kind of courses you take, because you're always trying to be defensive in your choices.